A Russian space probe came crashing back down to Earth over the weekend, the latest in a growing list of space program failures. The Mars explorer, called Phobos-Grunt, fell back to Earth on Sunday and apparently burned up on re-entry into the atmosphere somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. At $170 million, it was Russia's most expensive and ambitious mission since Soviet times. Its failure even to leave the Earth's orbit may impact Moscow's budget for the National Space Agency, Roscosmos. This was the seventh serious mishap on the Russian space program in a little over a year. According to the agency's head, Vladimir Popovkin, successive disasters could be the work of foreign saboteurs. So, what did we lose with Phobos-Grunt, and what have we learned? Are we likely to see fewer space exploration rubles from Russia, which was perhaps the lead country in this field? Is the United States, having pulled its shuttle program last year, out of the race now? And who is in? The Chinese, other emerging economies, or space tourist pioneers such as Sir Richard Branson? To look at this, we're hosting a discussion in our London studio. I'm joined by Nick Spall, who advocates for a British manned programme through the UK Human Spaceflight Campaign, and Sir Martin Sweeting, director of the Surrey Space Centre. First question to you, Nick. What went wrong with Phobos-Grunt?
Well, the awkward thing is we don't know, and I understand the Russians in Roscosmos don't know either. I mean, it made it into orbit, that we do know, and it's been photographed going overhead in a fairly stable orbit, but obviously gradually declined and re-entered because of the atmospheric effects. But we don't know why that third stage, which was due to lift it from orbit out to Mars on a long cruise, an 8-month cruise, we don't know why that rocket failed. Unfortunately, of course, this happens with interplanetary probes, and it's not unusual. The Americans have had failures over the years, and I'm sure as time goes by, gradually the failures will get less. I mean, there is that so-called Martian ghoul that stops these probes from working. There's only about, I think it's probably just over 60% of interplanetary probes that have gone to Mars on both sides, both the Russian and the American side, which have actually made it successfully. So it's a difficult one. It shows you how difficult deep space exploration is.
So Martin, do you agree with that Phobos-Grunt failed just because these kind of probes are so difficult to pull off? And also I'd be interested in finding out what we could have learned if the probe had come back. What would it have benefited us?
Well, I think it's true to say that about 60% of the attempts to go to Mars have ended up in failure. It is because it is a very demanding and tricky event. I mean, not least of all because we're trying to land on a planet, or in this case, on one of the moons of Mars, Phobos. I think one of the things we would have learned had Phobos-Grunt been successful is the constituents of this small moon. Did it come out of Mars, or was it a captured moon? Possibly would have given us some opportunities to look at some very pristine material in the solar system. Of course, now we won't know. I think it is worth saying that, of course, there have been also some dramatic successes on Mars. So although we've had less than 50% success rate, those that have worked have really been quite stunning. We've had the early Mariner Viking missions, and of course now we have the two NASA rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, which have been on the surface, I think, for 8 years. I mean, it's quite remarkable, and we've learned a great deal about the constituents of Mars, and discovered that there's even, it looks like substantial quantities of water on Mars. So yes, it's a great disappointment, but we have learned a lot along the way.
And open to both of you, what is it that went wrong about the project? Some have suggested that the Russians started the project too early without enough funding and a few holes in their technology.
It's interesting. I mean, years ago, the Americans lost a Mars polar lander, which was a similar thing where, in fact, it did leave Earth orbit, but failed on the way as it was approaching Mars. The problem is you can take the approach that the larger, the more complicated, the more expensive probes, in theory, should work better than the smaller, tighter budget probes. And we think of Britain's Beagle 2, which sadly was underfunded and many believe was lost because of that. It just wasn't robust enough to cope with its mission. But on the other hand, the sort of satellites and probes that Sir Martin manufactures shows you that you can produce very small probes and very low budget spacecraft and satellites, and they work perfectly perfectly well. So there's no hard and fast rule. I think it may well be all about creating redundancy in systems, which obviously is expensive, and I'm sure Sir Martin would know more about that than myself.
So, Martin, could it have been problems with the Russian equipment, or what Vladimir Popovkin, head of the Russian space agency Roscosmos, said, foreign saboteurs? Sort of conjures up the idea of a, James Bond-style villain destroying the Russian space project. Do you buy into that?
Well, personally, I think it's very, very unlikely, because once you start along that track, it's essentially declaring war in space, and that's really something I think that all parties that are in space at the moment want to avoid at all costs. So, personally, I think deliberate interference, I think, is highly unlikely. There have been a string of failures in the Russian space program in this last year, and indeed, we're working with some colleagues in Russia on some upcoming missions, and we know that they're paying a great deal of attention to trying to improve the quality and reliability. I think, however, the source of the problem is probably a little bit deeper. With the breakup of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 90s, up until about, past the year 2000, maybe even year 2005, the Russian space program was starved of funds. Obviously, the whole country was going through an economic upheaval, and the space program was not immune to that in any way. And I think to some extent there's been a sort of lost generation of engineers in Russia. The Soviet engineers, who had very capable, had a great deal of knowledge, weren't really able to pass that on to a new generation in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I think this is beginning to come through in the reliability and quality issues that have been emerging in this last year. It is reassuring to know that there's now a new generation coming along, but of course there's a bit of a gap between the current new generation and the old experienced generation. And I know that Vladimir Popovkin is trying very hard to bridge that gap, setting up some new ideas of trying to ensure quality, but it's a very tough challenge. But I'm absolutely sure that they will recover from this and get back into the space business in a more successful manner, particularly for deep space.
Nick, there have been budget increases in the Russian space program, but as Sir Martin says, these have been a difficult period. Is it fair to say that Moscow should not be spending so much money on space missions when it could be using the cash to build schools and hospitals?
Well, the merits of investing in a space industry are very strong, and we've seen around the world the way that the emerging industrialized nations, countries like obviously China, but also India, Brazil, they're very much focusing on space technology as a way of boosting their high-tech industries. Terrific benefits come out of taking that route, and it's a way of not only inspiring your young scientists and engineers to get into exciting things such as manufacturing satellites and building probes to Mars, but also establishing a sort of a basic infrastructure for high tech. And that's the thing of the future. The Chinese realise that. And I can't see the Russian space program ever shrinking too much because it's so important to an economy. Also, of course, you have to point out that it's a prestige matter as well. And there's obviously a great pride in Russia over its space program over the years. Russia was the first nation, obviously, to put a man into orbit, and indeed put a satellite into orbit back in 1957. But it also put the first space stations into orbit. The early Salyut and Mir space stations were, extraordinary achievements of their time. And Russia obviously has been a key part of the construction of the International Space Station.
So Martin, Nick points out this duality. What are the countries doing it for? Does it really bring benefits in terms of science and research and development? Or are these things that, China and India are now taking up really just about national pride and prestige and that country getting their flag up in space?
Well, of course, it's a bit of a mixture of both. But I think that actually the economic returns, the science returns far outweigh the glory, so to speak. And the glories are something that's nice to have, but it actually doesn't sort of pay the bills. And of course, every country that gets involved in space is very proud of its achievements. But actually, underneath all that is the underpinning benefits that come from the point of view of observing the Earth, getting better agriculture, better use of water resources and other minerals and basically the natural resources of the Earth, looking at the effects of weather, providing communications, and then not least of all, moving forward the technological base and expertise of the country. And we mustn't forget, too, that space is a very inspirational activity. It's very demanding, and it really attracts some of the brightest minds to come in to solve these problems. And this advances science, and eventually science advances technology, and technology makes its way into our everyday lives.
Doesn't the folding of the US Shuttle Program indicate something? If anybody was going to be able to make a buck out of something, it would be the Americans. And the closure of their project last year, doesn't that send a signal?
I'm not sure that the Americans, in that sense, are the best people making a buck out of space, because they have a very large space budget, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make a profit out of it. I think that, in fact, the UK has probably done one of the best of all countries in getting good value for money out of space, because it's focused on space applications and the use of space, and particularly joining what is called the upstream, the satellite manufacturers, to the downstream, which is those that exploit the satellites for services, and that's proved extremely profitable for the UK and contributing to the economy. Nevertheless, the folding of the closure of the shuttle program is I think not something that's necessarily symptomatic of space. It was just a particular manifestation of how to get into orbit, which had run its course, and now there need to be new ideas for launching our spacecraft into orbit more effectively and at much, much lower cost.
Nick, Sir Martin says that the British are getting good value for money from what could be described as a not particularly ambitious space program. Now, you advocate for something different, don't you? You argue for manned UK space exploration, which is something obviously the country hasn't been that interested in getting into in the past, and now you hope to convince Whitehall at this belt-tightening era of austerity. How do you expect to do that?
Well, because the big point to make is that the UK has lost out. We've actually, as Sir Martin says, we've made some money in building some small satellites, which is fine and it's cost effective. But we've lost out in the wider picture. We've lost out in having our own national astronauts, which is significant in terms of joining with the rest of the world. I mean, we're the only industrial nation, industrialised nation, which doesn't have a human spaceflight interest. And many would say that has resulted in us missing out on the inspirational value, the international cooperation, the scientific gains to be had from projects such as the International Space Station with its microgravity study work, all the materials study work, the human physiology study work that's going on as we speak with a crew of 6 on board the International Space Station. The UK has no part of that. And it's meant that, particularly for young people, the inspirational value of human spaceflight versus just the satellite construction side of space has been missed completely.
Sir Martin, Brits in space, is that what the British taxpayer needs in a time of austerity?
Well, I think I have a slightly different view. I would thoroughly agree with the inspiration of humans in space. In fact, it was something like this film 2001, I think, that inspired me to get into space in the first place and watching the Apollo moon landings. But I question the value in terms of the return to the economy. The UK is a relatively small economy, and a human spaceflight is very expensive. The scientific returns in terms of value for money from the ISS, or International Space Station, I think are certainly being debated. And I think that the UK is perhaps wise in having a relatively modest program and interest in some aspects of human spaceflight, but not putting a large part of its budget into that. Robotic exploration is something that can be managed within the sort of ambitions that we have and budgets we can muster in the UK, and return much better value scientific returns. Of course, there are always areas where humans are needed in space to address particular problems. But I think for the UK, I think we should focus on robotic exploration until such time as we see our economy develop dramatically, but contribute to the human exploration. And I think the UK can contribute to human exploration not by necessarily having astronauts as a major objective, but by providing a lot of the infrastructure that's going to be needed in space for sustained human habitation.
Nick, I would suggest that you're putting forward a more ambitious line than Sir Martin.
Yes, but within a reasonable budget. I mean, it's worth pointing out the UK is only spending a quarter of our equivalent European nations. I mean, France and Germany and Italy are spending 4 times as much as we do on civil space exploration or civil space industry. So in other words, our starting point is that we're much more frugal and much less ambitious. And I think that's a mistake. I think we're missing out on a lot. If we did spend more government money, we'd benefit much more.
That was Nick Spall arguing for Britons in Space for the UK Human Spaceflight Campaign, and I was also joined by Sir Martin Sweeting, Director of the Surrey Space Centre.